Youth-4 is called Fragrant Minutes.
When I asked Vicky Bird if he would come to speak to the Oxford Poetry Society, he immediately said no. He was an old fogey. He was a back number. He was a PIB. Poor, ignorant bastard, as he expressed it. Is Alistair Crowley a back number, I asked, because we've invited him too, and he's accepted. No, he said. You mustn't do that. It would be madness. Haven't I told you over and over again that he's an extremely dangerous man? I know you have, but you've never told me why. I've never told you because I'm not sure that you'll understand. But the next time we go for a walk together, I'll tell you what happened. That's a promise. But meanwhile, what about coming to Oxford? What wouldst thou I should choose as the subject of my address to the assembled multitude? Why not Blake's Marriage of Heaven and Hell? So be it. Amen. Later, when we were sitting beside the dew pond close by Chanctonbury Ring, he told me of his break with Crowley. One evening, they were invoking Mars, and the ceremony started as usual with Crowley as the high priest declaring the temple is open. There were the appropriate liturgies and invocations, and then Vicky Bird, who had been given a drug, rose to dance down the god. Dancing down, as I understood it, involved the abnegation of the dancer's own personality. He became a vacuum into which he drew the god. Never, in all the time he had been with Crowley, Vicky Bird said, had he been so successful. He was literally possessed by Mars. He was Mars. And then, said Vicky Bird, instead of declaring that the temple was closed, he deliberately dismissed us. Mars is the god of war, the god of killing. Don't you realize that when he dismissed us without closing the temple, he was sending not me, but the god Mars in me, loose on the streets of London? The god Mars is a killer, and he wanted to use my body. I fought him for 72 hours before I gained possession of my body again. So you see, little Arthur, if you have any faith in a PIB like me, please don't have anything to do with him. The lecture to the Poetry Society, dated some 2 months hence, became an obsession. I have so much to tell the younger generation, he said. Do you realize that I haven't given tongue since the year of our Lord 1912? I tried to warn him that the meetings of the Poetry Society were divertissements, not memorial lectures. Too much thought might cause more harm than too little. But the occasion, planted between the tropics of his imagination, grew with monstrous speed. Every day he read me fresh extracts from his work in progress, strings of magic plays on words which became progressively more elaborate. Poor Vicky Bird. When the day came, he arrived slashed and scarred from his shaving efforts as if he'd been waylaid by a razor gang. It was, without exception, the worst lecture which we had at the Poetry Society. Elusively allusive, it contained the peptonized wisdom of his lifetime without any of the roughage that his audience needed. His mystic shorthand was unintelligible. Afterwards, there was no discussion because there was nothing to discuss, and the meeting broke up an hour earlier than usual. I felt overwhelmed with guilt at having persuaded the little man to waste 2 months of his life preparing a fiasco, and searched my mind for a formula of consolation. We reached the moonlit Broad without a word spoken. I took his arm. Was it a terrible ordeal? I asked. An ordeal? It was wonderful. What a glorious thing youth is, and what an inspiration to address it. Did you notice how they hung on my words, their intent young faces fascinated? I am not, as you know, a conceited man, but I flatter myself that this evening I gave them something the like of which they had never heard before. It was good, you know. This has convinced me, little Arthur. I have been too long in the wilderness, But the days of exile are drawing to a close. We shall return to the land flowing with milk and honey. This is indeed life, he shouted, and burst into a neigh of laughter which echoed down the streets like a runaway horse. After this, the Poetry Society cast its net wider and wider. A daily newspaper had signed up a poetess called Wilhelmina Stitch. 6 days a week in a box appeared her fragrant minute, printed as prose, but with rhymes which popped up perkily at regular intervals. "We must, at all costs, get Wilhelmina Stitch," Hugh said. "What a scoop." "We'll never get her," I said. "She'll be far too suspicious. She's probably a man anyway." I was wrong. Wilhelmina Stitch was a woman, and she was far too curious to refuse. She came from the North Country, a tiny, sallow-faced, mousy-haired woman who had learned that her strength lay in exploiting her weakness. Stitch was her maiden name, but she clung to it in her work. Wilhelmina Stitch. It was a combination so absurd that no one could forget it. Yet at the same time it was not highfalutin. It was extraordinarily ordinary. It conjured up an image of dowdy worthiness, which her person and her poems reinforced. She was all of a piece. Over dinner, she made one essay into poetic small talk. Looking dreamily out of the windows of the Randolph at the trees growing in the churchyard beside the Martyrs' Memorial, she remarked, "Don't you love it when the chestnut trees in the spring take off their woolly gloves and stretch their baby fingers?" Stephen Spender, in the midst of swallowing clear soup, was caught by a paroxysm which returned it through the nose. Miss Stitch stopped short in the middle of a fancy about the chestnuts lighting up their little candles for the birthday of the May Queen, and there was an uneasy silence which remained unbroken until Hugh bent forward and asked her if she was an admirer of the works of her fellow poetess, Edith Sitwell. "I like them very much," she answered. "They are, of course, caviar to the multitude. I sometimes think it is a pity that she doesn't realize that while her poems may bring joy to a few hundred choice spirits like you and I, mine bring hope and heart ease to millions of poor people who have no other poetry in their lives. Some people think that the Fragrant Minute is just a job like any other, but if you read those sad letters I receive in thousands every week, you'd realize that it was something far, far more. Something, well, if you must have it, more like a sacred trust." Any doubts she might have had about herself had been allayed by fan mail and the crowded meetings she addressed in mining and industrial areas, wherever, in fact, the present was so drab and the future so uncertain that people welcomed any anodyne from betting to red biddy. The Fragrant Minute was a palliative, maybe, but it was cheaper and less noxious than most. Starting with a hostile audience, and there is no audience initially more cruel than that of Oxford or Cambridge undergraduates, she won them round with stories of people who wrote to her and who, through their letters, often gave her the ideas for Fragrant Minutes. Her poems might be bad, her philosophy sentimental, but the material on which they worked was the genuine stuff of life. We, her audience of that night, as she made us realize, were a privileged minority whose values might appear to us absolute, but were to most people living near the hunger line remote, unrealistic, and rather absurd. What is more, she was able to support herself with her poetry. Somehow or other, people managed to survive as writers. But how I could survive was quite a different question. I had edited the Oxford Outlook. I had written a few short stories which had been printed on the back page of the Manchester Guardian, but frankly, I had no qualifications for any job. "If you want to be a novelist," my father said, "wouldn't it be best to write a novel?" This had never occurred to me. "But how could I live while I'm writing it?" "How long does a novel take?" he asked. "I don't know," I said, "but an awfully long time. About a year, I think. And how much would you get for it?" £25, or with luck, 50. "You better wipe that out as a career, then," he said. "Maybe I could write a novel in 6 months, I suggested. "I'll continue your allowance for 3 months, he answered. "If you write 1,000 words a day, you'll finish it in 2, and then you can spend the last month typing and revising it." My mother and I went to live in Bonn while I wrote the novel at the rate of 1,000 words a day. I returned to London with the typescript of a 70,000-word novel in my suitcase. I had written a book, and my father, reading it through, pronounced that it wasn't bad for a first effort. It was submitted to a publisher. The moment that I'd put it in the post, I went back and read through the carbon. It was terrible. The rejection came in the form of a letter saying that the publisher regretted they could not publish the novel, but would be interested to see any further work I did. It was now that I realized that there were only two things holding me back in my career. The first was that I didn't know how to write, and the second was that I had nothing to write about. A chance meeting put me in the direction of solving the latter. I happened to bump into a writer called Wilson Disher, who had given an interesting lecture for the Oxford Poetry Society. Listening to my tale of woe, he suggested an unusual solution. You can always be a schoolmaster, you know. Good long holidays. But it would be hell, I objected. There's a lot to be said for hell if you're going to be a novelist, Disher answered. So much more goes on there. The older classrooms of Bogglesham Grammar School were like the older classrooms of any school, only a bit more so. The inky, mutilated desks and the highly polished seats managed to convey the boredom and impatience of the generations of children who had been cramped there. It was all too drearily familiar. From school to Oxford and from Oxford back to school, the fatal parabola of so many would-be writers. But then the headmaster opened a door into a different world. This would be where you would do most of your teaching, he said. It was a corrugated iron shed with an echoing floor and walls of varnished matchboarding. At the library and sixth form room, said the headmaster. At that moment, I looked down and placed my hand upon his sleeve. At his feet was a mound of ordure that could have been produced by no dog smaller than a St. Bernard or the hound of the Baskervilles. We surveyed it for a brief period, like two surrealists appraising an objet trouvé. Then the headmaster pointed to the pitch-pine door at the end of the shed. If you go through there, Mr. Calder-Marshall, you will find our new chapel, a truly noble pile, where you will observe a light burning perpetually in memory of the dear old Boggleshamians who died in the war. As he turned and made for his house, just gonna get a shovel. When he joined me at the altar a few minutes later, my mind was made up. I should like to take the job, sir. It's exactly what I have been looking for.
Clearer, 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 the skies were clearer, clearer, clearer. There you lose all your blue blues, laughing at love.